At the beginning of the war, everyone despised it. Soviet pilots called it the flying coffin. German aces called it easy prey, shooting them down by the dozen. In despair, its designers realized they had created the perfect trap for their own pilots. But very soon, upon hearing its wailing sound, German infantry would throw themselves to the ground and pray. They would give it another name: the Black Death. In this film, we will show how a death trap of a plane, born from a fatal command error, was transformed into the most ruthless weapon of World War II. This is the story of how a machine, designed for death, became the most mass-produced combat aircraft in all of human history. Major Hermann Graf, one of the Luftwaffe's leading experts on combating the Il-2, tapped a diagram of the Russian ground attack aircraft with a pointer. Young pilots, who had just arrived on the Eastern Front, sat in the hall. Their faces were tense. They had already heard the terrible stories about the concrete bombers and the Black Death. "Forget everything you were taught in the West," Graf said harshly. "This isn't a Spitfire. This isn't an aerial joust. This is a hunt for an armored boar, and if you just shoot at it randomly, you'll waste your ammunition and come back with nothing, or you won't come back at all." He jabbed the pointer at the Il-2's silhouette. Its armored fuselage is a fortress. Firing at the cockpit or the engine from above is useless. Your shells will just bounce off. The wings? You can turn them into a sieve, but it will still make it back to its airfield. Stop shooting at the wings. Silence fell in the hall. The young pilots exchanged glances. If the plane was so invulnerable, how were they supposed to shoot it down? "Every beast has a vulnerable spot," Graf continued, a predatory note entering his voice. "An Achilles heel, and the Il-2 has one too." The pointer slid down, beneath the aircraft's massive engine. Here it is, the oil cooler, small, covered by thin armored shutters. But it is the heart of its cooling system. Your mission is to get to it. Approach from below and behind, from the gunner's blind spot, and deliver a precise strike right here. The tactic was developed and honed in hundreds of aerial battles. It required surgical precision and nerves of steel. The hunt for the Il-2 had become a deadly science. Lieutenant Sidorov, an Il-2 pilot, was leading his group in for an attack. He was constantly looking around, craning his neck. He knew they were here, the hunters. He couldn't see them, but he could feel them, and he knew where the strike would come from. Suddenly, his plane shuddered violently. A short, vicious burst of fire tore through the fuselage from below. Sidorov glanced at his instruments. The oil pressure was starting to drop. The needle was crawling, slowly but surely, toward the red line. He found it. Damn it, he found my Achilles heel. The engine was still running, but Sidorov knew it was in its death throes. In 5, maybe 10 minutes, the oil would be gone completely, and the engine would seize. He had to push on, make it back to friendly lines. Just 10 kilometers. 10 kilometers that turned into an eternity. The famous ace Hans Ulrich Rudel, who flew a Stuka, would later state the rule with utmost clarity. The Russian Il-2 is very tough. It can only be attacked from behind and above, aiming for the gunner's cockpit, or shot down with a precise hit to the oil cooler. The Germans adapted. They stopped seeing the Il-2 as an invulnerable monster. They studied it, found its weakness, and turned the hunt into a precise, cold-blooded tactic. They learned how to deliver a single, precise, fatal blow. Now, every mission for the Soviet attack pilots became an even more dangerous game. They knew that up there, in the sky, professionals were hunting them. Hunters who knew where to strike, and who did not forgive mistakes. Captain Romanov's squadron approached the target, a German railway hub. Below, laid out as if on the palm of a hand, were trains with military equipment, warehouses, and smoking locomotives. But Romanov was not looking down, but up, at the clear, treacherously bright sky. He knew they were already here. The hunters. "Attention, hunchbacks!" His calm voice came over the radio. "We're working the circle. Leader, I'm going in." His Il-2 dipped its wings and began a smooth descent toward the target. In that same instant, a pair of Focke-Wulfs dropped out of the clouds. One of them immediately got on Romanov's tail, but just as he was about to open fire, a long burst hit him from the left, from another Ilyushin. The German fighter swerved away, dodging the tracers. This was the answer. The Soviet attack pilots' answer to the precise tactics of the German aces. They understood. They couldn't survive alone. Their strength was in unity. Thus, the circle of death was born. 6 or 8 attack planes would form a closed circle over the target. They moved in a circular pattern, like a carousel. Each aircraft's gunner covered the tail of the plane in front. For the German fighters, it was hell. It was a hornet's nest. "Kolya, cover me!" Romanov shouted into the microphone, pulling his plane out of the attack. "Vanya, engage the target!" Another attack plane immediately took his place in the dive, and Romanov's gunner was already firing on the second Focke-Wulf, which was trying to attack the pilot to his right. They were a single organism, a moving, firing fortress with no vulnerable spots. To try and attack one meant immediately exposing yourself to the crossfire of 5 or 6 machine guns. For those on the ground, this tactic was even more terrifying. This was not just a raid. It was a relentless wall of fire, a carousel of death hanging overhead, never letting them lift their heads. One Il would pull out of a dive, strafing everything with cannon fire, while another immediately took its place, dropping bombs. A third would be hammering positions with rockets. The roar never ceased for a second. The legendary fighter pilot, Alexander Pokrishkin, spoke of these pilots with respect. We called them the hunchbacked workhorses. Our job was to cover them. Losing an attack pilot was worse than losing your own plane. Without them, the infantry was blind and defenseless. The fighter escorts drove off the main enemy forces, while the attack pilots themselves, gathered in their deadly flock, could fend for themselves. The German pilot, after circling this fiery dance, understood. There would be no easy prey today. Breaking through that wall of tracers was suicide. He dipped his wings and left, and below, a transport train carrying tanks was burning. Captain Romanov gathered his group and led them home. They had done their job again. They had survived because they had learned to fight together. They had turned their greatest weakness, their slowness and clumsiness, into their greatest weapon. They had become a pack. And now, the hunters had to think twice before attacking this armored, snarling hornet's nest. The hospital ward smelled of carbolic acid and hopelessness. Lieutenant Vasily Emelianenko looked at his hands, or rather, at what was left of them. Pink, taut pieces of flesh, scarred over, where fingers could barely be discerned. The face in the mirror was a stranger's, a mask of scars left by the flames of a downed Il-2. He had made it. He had belly-landed the burning plane and lost consciousness. And when he came to, he heard the doctor's verdict. Dry, official, final. Unfit for flight duty. Unfit. That word sounded more terrifying than the whistle of bullets. It meant the end. The end of the sky. The end of planes. The end of a war that, for him, was not yet over. He saw the faces of his comrades who hadn't returned from their missions. He remembered the roar of German tanks, and the thought of him sitting here, in the rear, while they were out there. That thought was unbearable. One night, he escaped from the hospital. In tattered hospital pajamas, across a snow-covered field, he reached a station and took a freight train to the front, to his regiment. The commander, upon seeing him, was speechless. A ghost was standing before him, a man with a masked face and mutilated hands, demanding one thing: to be given a plane. "Vasya, are you insane?" the commander said. "You can't even hold the control stick." "I can," Emelianenko answered stubbornly. They took him to a plane. He climbed into the cockpit. He tried to grip the control stick with his maimed fingers. The pain was excruciating. His hands wouldn't obey. The stick slipped from his grasp. Then he asked a mechanic to bring him some straps, and in front of the entire regiment, he tied his burned, helpless hands to the control stick. He became one with the machine, an extension of its rods and levers. He started the engine, and he lifted the Il-2 into the sky. The doctors who had come for him stood on the ground, silently watching the plane bank over the airfield. They shook their heads. It was impossible. It contradicted every medical principle. But in this man's eyes, there was such fury, such a will to live and to seek revenge, that they were afraid to refuse him. They signed the certificate, fit with limitations. There were dozens like Emelianenko, pilot Ivan Drachenko, who lost his right eye in combat. The doctor's verdict was unequivocal, grounded, but he got his way. He returned to service and continued to fly the Il-2, becoming one of the few to be a full Cavalier of the Order of Glory and a hero of the Soviet Union. "I could see a target better with one eye than many could with two," he would say with bitter pride. This was not just a war of engines and armor. It was a war of character, of spirit, of the unbreakable will of men who refused to surrender, who, having lost their health and suffered terrible injuries, still got up and went into battle. They tied themselves to their control sticks. They flew with one eye. They proved every day that the human spirit is stronger than fire, stronger than steel, and stronger than death itself. Their war didn't end in a hospital ward. It ended only there, over the target, or in a final fiery dive. The summer of 1944, Operation Bagration. Captain Novikov was leading his squadron of Ils over liberated Belorussia. Below, under his wing, stretched a highway. But it wasn't a road. It was a long, winding scar on the body of the earth, clogged with thousands of German vehicles, carts, and guns. Army Group Center was retreating, or rather, it was trying to retreat. Novikov dipped his wings, signaling the attack. There were no excited shouts in his headphones, no rage, just a calm, businesslike voice. First flight of 6, work the head of the column. Second, the tail. The objective is to cork it and burn it. This was no longer a battle. It wasn't a risky duel with fighters and anti-aircraft guns. By 44, Soviet aviation had achieved complete dominance in the air. The Luftwaffe was practically destroyed. The Wehrmacht's anti-aircraft batteries had been scattered and ground down in previous battles. Now, this was a job, a cold-blooded, methodical, ruthless job of destruction. His Il-2 went into a shallow dive. Below him wasn't an army. It was just a target, a long line of little boxes that needed to be burned. Novikov squeezed the trigger. The 23mm cannons began to speak. He saw the lead armored personnel carrier erupt in flames and block the road. The trap had sprung shut, and then the extermination began. The Sturmoviks moved along the road like reapers through a field. Pass after pass, they strafed ammunition trucks, which went up in giant fireballs. They dropped bombs on clusters of infantry, who scrambled along the roadsides looking for cover. They fired rockets at artillery tractors, turning the guns into useless scrap metal. Down below, in that column, Corporal Klaus Meyer desperately tried to pull a wounded comrade from a burning truck. He could no longer hear individual explosions. The entire world had become a solid, unending roar. The sky above was black with smoke and those terrible, hunchbacked silhouettes. They didn't fly away. They just hung over them, like vultures, picking them off as if in a shooting gallery, without haste, without mercy. Klaus gave up. He fell into a ditch, covering his head with his hands. He could neither fight nor flee. The road ahead and behind was blocked by the flaming wrecks of vehicles and the bodies of his comrades. This was the end. This was the road to hell. And the angels of death on this road were the Russian Sturmoviks. Captain Novikov made his final pass, dropped his remaining bombs, and gathering his group, turned eastward. Below, everything that could still burn was burning out. The job was done. He felt neither joy nor hatred, only a dull, heavy exhaustion. In 3 years of war, he had seen too much death, and today he had simply added another page to its endless book. During Operation Bagration, Sturmoviks conducted more than a quarter of all combat sorties. They didn't just support the offensive. They were its battering ram. They broke through German defenses, sowed chaos in the rear, and turned any enemy retreat into a bloody massacre. The roads of Belorussia became a giant graveyard for hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, and over each of these roads hung the shadow of the Ilyushin, the shadow of the Black Death. April 1945. Berlin. The city, for 1,000 years considered the heart of the Reich, had turned into an agonizing beast. It snarled back with fire from every window, every cellar. The streets, clogged with rubble, became the last line of defense. The fighting was for every floor, for every stone. Major Belov, commander of a Sturmovik regiment, looked at a map of the city. For his Il-2s, there were no familiar targets here. No tank columns, no supply trains. The city itself had become the target. His regiment was no longer just aviation. It had become flying artillery, sniper-like, surgically precise, and merciless. Below, on one of the streets, Captain Ivanov's assault group was pinned down by heavy fire. A heavy machine gun was firing from the attic of a corner building. It had pinned the infantry to the ground, not letting them raise their heads. Tanks couldn't approach. The narrow street was covered by Faustniks from the windows opposite. A hoarse voice crackled over the radio. The infantry commander. "Hunchback! Do you hear me, Hunchback? 4-story building on the right. The attic. Give us some fire, brother. We can't take much more." Belov relayed the coordinates to one of his pilots. Lieutenant Orlov, the same one who had miraculously survived in 41, nodded and broke away from the group. He knew this job well. In Stalingrad, they had learned how to fight in cities. He approached the target not from the street, but from the courtyard, at an extremely low altitude, almost scraping the rooftops. There it was, the building, 4th floor, the attic window from which muzzle flashes erupted. Orlov didn't drop bombs. He might hit his own men. He aimed slightly higher and fired a short, precise burst from his 23mm WWII cannons. The armor-piercing shells tore through the brickwork with ease. A part of the roof and wall, along with the machine gun crew, simply ceased to exist. "Thanks, Hunchback. Thanks, buddy," a voice shouted in his headphones. "Ura, forward!" The infantry rose to attack, and on the other side, in the basement of the next building, 16-year-old Volkssturm member Kurt clutched his Faust patron. He had seen the Russian plane take out the machine gun nest. He heard the walls crumbling. He understood. They couldn't hold this street. They could stop a tank. They could repel an infantry assault. But how do you fight something that comes from above? Something that obliterates entire floors with a single strike? There was nowhere for them to hide. The Il-2 was everywhere in the skies over Berlin. The Sturmoviks suppressed anti-aircraft positions on the roofs. They demolished barricades, clearing the way for tanks. They burned out the Faustniks holed up on the upper floors. They were the eyes and the fist of the advancing army. When Soviet soldiers stormed the Reichstag, Ilyushins were still circling above its burning dome. They made their final circles over the defeated city, finishing off the last pockets of resistance. Their long, bloody journey, which began in June of '41, was coming to an end here, in the sky over Berlin. The flying Coffin, which had become the Black Death, had finished its work. The agony of the Reich ended to the roar of its engine. May 1945. Silence fell. The very same silence they had dreamed of for 4 long years. A silence that was, at first, hard to believe. It was not broken by the wail of sirens, the thunder of anti-aircraft guns, or the roar of engines. The war was over. Colonel Sokolov, the same one who had lost 9 gunners, stood at the edge of an airfield near Berlin, looking at his Ilyushins. They stood frozen in neat rows, silent, covered in soot and patches. Every scar on their armor was a story of battle, of survival, of a comrade's death. How much he had been through with them. His Ilyusha. It was closer to him than some people. Rough, stubborn, reliable as a soldier's boot. It had pulled him out of infernos from which it seemed there was no return. And then, a few months later, the order came. Thousands of Il-2 Sturmoviks, the air and bread of the Red Army, the victory aircraft, began to be decommissioned en masse. The war was over, and for machines born for war, there was no place left in the peaceful sky. Their time had passed. Sokolov watched as workers with cutting torches arrived at the airfield. They approached his plane, the very one in which he had made it all the way to Berlin. The flame of the torch bit into the armored wing. There was a screech of metal. They were cutting it into pieces like an animal carcass, his faithful combat companion. He felt sad, bitter, but somewhere, deep down, he understood. Perhaps it was for the best. These machines, saturated with the smell of gunpowder, oil, and blood, had no place among the clouds of a peaceful sky. Their work, dirty, terrible, bloody, was done. 36,183 aircraft. An entire armada, the most mass-produced in human history. An armada that was fading into oblivion. Decades later, the designer Yakovlev, Ilyushin's eternal rival, would write, "Ilyushin created an outstanding battlefield aircraft. No one in the world was able to replicate anything like it. It was the truth. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't fast. It wasn't the most advanced. It was different. It was the embodiment of the character of the nation that created it. Crude, simple, unbreakable, and ready to win at any cost. Today, only a few flying examples remain, restored by enthusiasts piece by piece from swamps and forests. They take off at air shows, and spectators see only an angular, strange aircraft from the past. They don't hear, in the roar of its engine, the voices of those who never returned. They don't see in its scars the designer's desperation, Stalin's fury, the feet of the workers on the home front. They don't feel the terror of the German infantryman or the pain of the pilot who lost his 9th gunner. But sometimes, when this last Ilyusha flies low over the ground, that very same silence falls, and in it, memory is born. A memory of the aircraft that everyone despised, and which became a legend. The flying tank, the Black Death, The aircraft that was born a death trap, but died a victor. 1940. Moscow. The design bureau of Sergei Ilyushin. It was quiet in the office, a silence broken only by the scratching of a pencil on a drawing board that you could almost touch. Blueprints lay on the enormous table. This was the crown of his creation, an aircraft with no equal in the world, the BSH-2 armored ground attack aircraft. Ilyushin looked upon it with a father's pride. He had created not just a machine, he had created survival. His creation, encased in a steel cocoon, was meant to hang over the battlefield, fearing neither bullets nor shrapnel, and methodically destroy the enemy. A load-bearing armored shell, 4 to 12 millimeters thick, it wasn't just protection. It was the aircraft's structural frame, into which, like a safe, the pilot, engine, and fuel tanks were hidden. A flying fortress. But this silence would soon be shattered by the cold voice of military acceptance, a voice that would change everything. The Air Force representatives were pragmatic. They didn't look at the idea, but at the numbers, weight, speed, range. And their verdict was as sharp as an axe blow. The aircraft was too heavy. Its speed was insufficient to escape from fighters. The solution, radical. Remove the gunner. Remove the machine gun protecting the rear hemisphere. For the military, it was simple arithmetic. Hundreds of kilograms of weight gone. Dozens of kilometers per hour added to its speed. Simplified production. In their eyes, it was the pure, undeniable mathematics of victory. A gunner was a luxury that makes the ground attack aircraft slow and vulnerable to attacks from the front. The decision seemed logical to them. Pragmatic. For Ilyushin, it sounded like a death sentence. He tried to argue, to explain, to prove his point. Every fighter pilot in the world knows the main rule of aerial combat. Get on their six, attack from the tail, from the blind spot, where the enemy is blind and defenseless. Removing the gunner meant throwing that door wide open for any Messerschmitt. In response, he heard only the cold iron of an order. The ground attack aircraft must operate at low altitude by surprise. It doesn't need a gunner. It needs speed. Ilyushin was left alone with his blueprints. He looked at the place where the gunner's cockpit should have been, the place he had designed as a life guarantee for the pilot. And he understood. They couldn't see past the numbers, kilograms, kilometers per hour. But he saw the faces of the young men who would one day sit in this cockpit. With his own hands, obeying the order, he was turning a flying fortress into a death trap, into a coffin with a motor. The designer's hand trembled. The pencil, with its lead the color of blued steel, slowly erased the gunner's cockpit from the drawing board, leaving only emptiness behind the pilot, smooth, aerodynamic, and completely defenseless. At that moment, a new aircraft was born, a single-seater, faster, lighter. It would be called the Il-2, an armored predator whose spine was broken on the drawing board, a mighty beast whose eyes were gouged out so it couldn't see the danger creeping up from behind. The assembly line was started. Hundreds of machines were being prepared for deployment to the troops, and no one yet knew that the designer who had created one of the most protected aircraft in the world had, in fact, designed the perfect trap, a trap that would very soon snap shut. June 1941. A dusty field airstrip right on the border. Lieutenant Orlov gazed at his Il-2. It seemed invulnerable to him. Squat, angular, clad in armor, the instructors at the academy called it the flying tank. The word tank sounded like a promise of survival. First combat mission. Below, on the road, a gray snake of a German column slithered along. Orlov put his ground attack aircraft into a shallow dive. Hand on the trigger. A moment. And the two 20mm Schwack cannons began their work. He saw the ground under his wing literally being ripped open. Trucks blew apart into splinters. Flashes of fire. Plumes of black smoke. Infantrymen scrambled into the ditches in panic. In that moment, Orlov believed. He believed in his aircraft. This was a machine of annihilation. And then the sky above him shattered. For Hauptmann Erich Weiss, an ace with 30 victories marked on the tail of his Messerschmitt, this wasn't even a hunt. It was an execution. He saw the aircraft plain as day, slow, clumsy, with a huge blind spot behind its tail. A perfect target for gunnery practice. He saw no tank, no fortress. He saw only what the Germans had already contemptuously nicknamed Russian plywood. Orlov heard a dry crackle, as if someone had thrown a handful of gravel against his armored seatback. He instinctively yanked the control stick, trying to look back. But behind the canopy was only the wall of his own fuselage. He was blind, absolutely blind. Back there, in the emptiness where the gunner should have been, death was now in command. A second hit. The acrid smell of burning filled the cockpit. The instruments began to dance. His flying tank had turned into a cage, a trap. Erich Weiss came around again and again, unhurried, without risk. He watched his tracers bite into the clumsy silhouette. He saw a thin stream of black smoke trail from the machine. An easy victory. Another mark on his tail fin. The summer of '41 became a bloodbath for the ground attack aviation. New Ils were thrown into battle without fighter cover. Untrained, recent cadets sent to certain death. The statistics were merciless. The life of a ground attack pilot at the front lasted 10, maybe 12 combat missions. Then, the end. Very soon, the Soviet pilots themselves gave their aircraft a new name, a bitter, terrible, but all too accurate one. The Flying Coffin. Every mission was the last. They took off knowing they couldn't even snap back. They were targets, senseless sacrifices. The pilots went into battle as if on their final journey, leaving behind their meager belongings and letters that would never be sent. In the German headquarters, they read the reports from their aces and smirked. Dozens of Ilyushins shot down every day. These armored monsters turned out to be surprisingly fragile, clumsy, blind. They were a gift for any Luftwaffe pilot. And on the Soviet airfields, the evenings grew quieter. Bunks in the dugouts emptied. Mechanics silently patched holes in the machines that could still be saved. They looked to the sky, to the east, but hope wasn't flying from there. New aircraft were, the same single-seaters, just as defenseless. New flying coffins for new condemned men. Ilyushin's nightmare had become reality, and this was only the beginning. December 1941. Moscow, the Kremlin. Outside, a blizzard howled, burying the anti-tank hedgehogs on the capital's streets in snow. But in Stalin's office, there was a thick, heavy silence. On the desk, under the green baize of a table lamp, lay reports from the front. The Red Army, gathering its last reserves, had launched a counter-offensive. It was driving the Germans back from Moscow. But the price of this offensive was monstrous. Every line in the reports screamed of one thing. The infantry was choking on its own blood. Tanks were getting bogged down in the snow under German artillery fire. Fortified villages, turned into strongholds, had to be taken in frontal assaults, carpeting the fields with bodies. And all the generals, from Zhukov to Rokossovsky, were asking, demanding, begging for one thing: air support for ground attack aircraft. But there were no ground attack aircraft. In the autumn, under the enemy's onslaught, the aircraft factories had been evacuated east to Kuibyshev. The giant industrial hearts of the country had been ripped out and moved 1,000 kilometers away. And there, deep in the rear, they fell silent. Production of the Il-2 had stopped. The front, bleeding out, was left without its main weapon. Stalin read these reports, and his fury was quiet, cold, and all the more terrifying for it. He saw this not as a simple logistical failure. He saw it as sabotage, a crime. At a moment when the country's fate hung by a thread, those who were supposed to be forging the weapons of victory were silent. On the 23rd of December, he picked up a pencil. The telegram he dictated was addressed to the directors of factories number 1 and number 18. It was not an order. It was the crack of a whip. The Il-2 aircraft are now as necessary to our Red Army as air, as bread. There was no pathos in these words, only a harsh, primal necessity. Air, bread, the things without which a person cannot live. The Il-2 was now ranked alongside them. It was no longer just an aircraft. It had become a condition for the nation's survival. And then came the threat, disguised as a polite request, which only made it more sinister. I ask you not to test the government's patience and demand that more Ils be produced. 1,000 kilometers from Moscow, in wind-blasted, freezing Kuibyshev, a factory director received this telegram. He was standing in the middle of an unfinished workshop where workers were trying to assemble machinery out in the open, in the snow. He had no people, no heat, no tools. His workers were women and teenagers, barely able to stand from hunger. And now he held this slip of paper in his hands. Was it an order or a death warrant? How could they demand aircraft when you didn't even have a roof over your head? But he knew what the phrase, "not to test the government's patience," meant. In wartime, it meant only one thing: a firing squad. There was no choice. Stalin had left them no choice. You could freeze to death at your machine, die of starvation, but give the front its aircraft. Or you could be shot as an enemy of the people. The fury born in the silence of the Kremlin office flew to the snowy Volga and transformed into a desperate, inhuman energy. The assembly line had to start, at any cost, even at the cost of the lives of those who assembled it. Kuibyshev, December 1941. The ground, frozen a meter deep, refused to accept the foundations of the new workshops. An icy wind from the Volga swept across the vast construction site, which only yesterday had been an open field. Here, under the open sky, the evacuated plant number 18 from Voronezh was setting up its operations. 17-year-old Anya, wrapped in a tattered sheepskin coat, was tightening a nut on an aircraft wing with the last of her strength. Her fingers wouldn't obey, numb from the frost. She hadn't eaten anything hot in days. Next to her, by a machine, stood her mother. They had come here with the factory. Their father and older brother were at the front. Stalin's telegram hung in every workshop. It was copied by hand and posted in prominent places. Like air, like bread. These words needed no explanation. Everyone here understood them with their heart. Air was what they breathed, mixed with frozen vapor and the smell of machine oil. Bread was the 125 grams of a sticky, damp mass issued on ration cards, and the planes they were assembling in these inhuman conditions were, for them, the same as bread, the same as air. Their only hope. The workday lasted 12, and sometimes 18 hours. People slept right by their machines to avoid wasting time on the journey to the cold barracks. Women and teenagers, who made up to 70% of the workforce, carried heavy metal sheets, riveted armored hulls, and assembled engines. Their hands, accustomed to sewing or a school pen, now smelled of metal and death. They didn't think about heroism. They thought about how to survive until morning, how to get warm, and how to build one more plane. Because every assembled fuselage, every attached wing, was for them a personal revenge. Revenge for the husbands, fathers, and brothers who were now fighting near Moscow. This was their front, without trenches or attacks, but no less cruel. In just 2 months, a miracle occurred. A miracle born of desperation, hunger, and fury. The impossible assembly line, mounted in an open field in the bitter cold, came to life. At the end of December 1941, the first Il-2 assembled in Kuibyshev rolled off it. And at the front, in the snow-covered trenches, the soldiers had already stopped waiting. They thought the country, retreating eastward, had forgotten them, that they were left alone. But one morning, in the gray, frosty sky, they heard a familiar roar. First one, then another, and another. From the east came echelons of new Ilyushins. This was more than a reinforcement. It was a voice from the home front, a voice that said, "We are alive, we are working, we are with you." Seeing those angular, hump-backed silhouettes, the infantry understood. The country was not broken. There was hope. In Kuibyshev, at peak production, up to 45 aircraft would roll off the assembly line per day. One attack aircraft every 30 minutes. The impossible assembly line was working, and now nothing could stop it. 1942. Oberleutnant Kurt Schmidt, a Luftwaffe ace with 47 victories, was confident. He spotted the group of 6 Ilyushins from a distance. A familiar sight, slow, clumsy machines flying just above the ground. For him, this was routine. Familiar, pleasant work to add to his personal tally. He came up on their tail from the direction of the sun, the perfect position. No one saw him. Schmidt chose the one on the end, the wingman. He calmly lined it up in his sights. He knew this machine like the back of his hand. Weak spots, the oil cooler under the belly, the wooden tail section. A few accurate hits, and the Russian plywood plane would go up like a match. He placed his fingers on the trigger, anticipating an easy victory. And at that moment, the Ilyushin fired. A fiery stream of tracers shot towards him from the tail of the Russian plane. Surprised, Schmidt instinctively yanked the stick, pulling his Messerschmitt up. He couldn't believe his eyes. They're shooting? From the rear? Since when did they have gunners? This wasn't in any intelligence report. It was simply impossible. On the ground, in the cockpit of that very Il-2, 19-year-old Sergeant Pyotr Kovalyov gripped the handles of his heavy-caliber UBT machine gun. He had just been transferred from the infantry. He had never been in the air before. He sat with his back to the direction of flight, and the entire world for him was just the earth rushing away behind him. When the pilot's cry came over the headphones, "Messer behind us," he froze in terror. And then he saw the rapidly growing dot of the enemy fighter in his sights. Pyotr squeezed his eyes shut and pressed the trigger. The machine gun thundered, filling the cramped cabin with the smell of gunpowder. He wasn't aiming. He was just shooting in the enemy's direction. Shooting out of fear, out of desperation. Lieutenant Sidorov, the pilot of this Il, for the first in 100 combat sorties, heard not the dead silence behind him, but the furious roar of his own machine gun. He didn't know if his gunner had hit anything or not, but that no longer mattered. What mattered was that he was no longer a defenseless target. He had a chance to survive. Kurt Schmidt made another pass, more cautiously, but the second Ilyushin in the group also spat fire. This changed everything. This broke all the rules of the hunt. Before, it had been a slaughter. Now, it was a fight. A risky, dangerous fight. He broke off the attack. 6 machine guns pointing backward were too serious an argument. Starting in the summer of 42, the 2-seater Il-2M began arriving at the front in large numbers. The designer, Ilyushin, having gotten his way, had given the plane its gunner back. This wasn't just a technical change. It was a tactical revolution. German aces, accustomed to unpunished attacks from the rear hemisphere, increasingly met with sudden and ferocious resistance. Erich Hartmann himself, the most successful pilot in history, would later admit, shooting down an Il-2 was incredibly difficult. There was only one way to attack it, from below and behind, aiming for the vulnerable radiator. The plane began to bite back. The sting in its tail wasn't always fatal for the enemy, but it gave the Soviet pilots the most important thing: time. A few seconds to maneuver, a few seconds to call for fighter cover. The few seconds that separated life from death. They were no longer blind kittens that could be drowned one by one. They had become angry, armored wolves, and now they could show their teeth. Feldwebel Günther Richter, pilot of a Focke-Wulf 1-90 fighter, was furious. He had just emptied almost his entire ammunition load into the Russian attack plane. He saw it all. Saw the shells tear through the wing skin. Saw splinters fly from the fuselage. These Russians were still using wood in their construction. Smoke poured from the engine. By all the laws of aerodynamics and war, this Il-2 should have plummeted to the ground, fallen apart in the air, exploded, but it flew on, stubbornly, heavily, leaving a black trail behind it, but it continued to fly toward the front line. Günther made another pass, raking it with machine gun fire. He was aiming for a sure kill, but the attack plane seemed to ignore these bites. It just kept flying. Günther watched it until it disappeared over the horizon. Returning to the airfield, he reported to his commander, "I put everything I had into him. He should have fallen to pieces, but he just keeps going. What are they making them out of? Concrete?" That word, concrete, stuck. The German pilots, faced with the phenomenal survivability of the Il-2, nicknamed it the Beton Bomber, the concrete bomber. It was a nickname born of powerlessness and bewilderment. A few minutes later, on a Soviet airfield, a technician gasped. Lieutenant Babailov's crippled Il was dragging itself toward the runway. Almost the entire left wing had been torn off after a collision with a Messerschmitt. The tail looked like a sieve. A hot stream gushed from a punctured oil line. But the engine was working. The pilot was alive. Babailov landed the mangled machine on its belly. When he staggered out of the cockpit, the mechanics surrounded the plane. They silently looked at the hole in the wing a man could climb through, looked at the hundreds of holes in the fuselage, at the severed control rods. And one of them, an old aircraft technician, took off his cap and said with respect, "Now that's what I call an arrival, Lieutenant. A real flying tank." The Il-2's survivability became a legend on both sides of the front. The secret was in that armored shell designed by Ilyushin. This steel cocoon protected everything vital: the pilot, the engine, the fuel tanks. Bullets and shrapnel could turn the wooden tail to splinters, riddle the wings, but as long as the armored hull was intact, as long as the engine was running, the plane stayed alive. Pilots returned to their airfields in machines that seemed, in principle, incapable of flight, with punctured engine cylinders, with non-working elevators, with huge holes in their wings. They would fly back, and overnight, the technicians would work miracles. They patched holes, replaced entire assemblies, and by morning, the wounded birds were were ready for battle again. This incredible resistance to damage had a colossal psychological effect. Soviet pilots believed in their aircraft. They knew it would give them a chance to make it back to their own lines, even after being hit. For the German pilots, however, every fight with a concrete bomber turned into hard, grueling work. They spent precious ammunition and time on a single machine that stubbornly refused to fall. The Il-2 was not just an airplane, it was a symbol of stubbornness, a coarse, indestructible, armored stubbornness that was impossible to understand, but one that had to be reckoned with. July 1943, the Battle of Kursk. Panzer Grenadier Friedrich Schultz sat on the armor of his Tiger. He felt invincible. His tank was the pinnacle of engineering. Its 100mm frontal armor laughed at the shells of Soviet anti-tank guns. They bounced off it like peas against a wall. Ahead, in the haze of the heated air, an entire armada of identical steel monsters was preparing to attack. Today, they were to break through the Russian defenses. Suddenly, something in the sky changed. A roar was building. It wasn't fighters, and it wasn't bombers. It was them. The Black Death. Dozens of Ilyushins were flying low over the ground, blocking out the sun. But Friedrich just smirked. Their 23mm cannons were powerless against his armor. He saw shells striking sparks on the hulls of neighboring tanks, causing no harm. Helpless rage. And then, a rain began to fall from the sky. A strange, quiet, almost silent rain. A fine hail drummed on the turret roof. Friedrich looked up in bewilderment. Hundreds of small, dark objects were detaching from the attack planes. They fell slowly, chaotically. What was it? Leaflets? In the next instant, the world exploded. The tank to his left, a brand new Panther, was suddenly engulfed in fire. A column of flame erupted from under its turret. Then another, and another. The entire field, where just a moment ago the indestructible German panzers had stood, turned into a roaring bonfire. The screams of burning crews mixed with the thunder of exploding ammunition. Friedrich couldn't understand what was happening. They weren't being bombed. No cannons were firing at them. Where was this fire coming from? At an altitude of 200 meters, Captain Igorov, a pilot of an Il-2, pressed a single button. 4 cassettes in the bomb bays opened, and 192 small PTAB bombs rained down. He didn't need to aim. He didn't need to dive. He simply passed over the cluster of enemy vehicles like a sour over a field. Each of these 1.5-kilogram bombs carried a shaped charge. Upon hitting the armor, it didn't smash it, but burned through it. A thin, needle-like jet of molten metal and gases, with a temperature of thousands of degrees, pierced the tank's thinnest top armor. It went right through, turning the fighting compartment into hell. The crew burned alive. Fuel tanks exploded. Shells detonated. Friedrich Schultz, having climbed out of his miraculously intact Tiger, looked at the battlefield in horror. Dozens of tanks, the pride of the Wehrmacht, had been turned into smoldering, twisted coffins. The hellish rain that had poured from the sky did what neither cannons nor mines could. It had destroyed their invincibility. In his diary, a German tank officer would later write, "The Russian attack aircraft are a plague. They hang over the battlefield for hours, not letting us raise our heads. Our tanks are burning one after another. The anti-aircraft defense can do nothing against these armored monsters." The Battle of Kursk became a triumph for the Il-2. The new weapon, the PTABs, turned it from a simple ground attack aircraft into the most effective tank killer of the Second World War. Soviet pilots were given a key that could open any armor. They no longer needed to aim for vulnerable spots. They simply covered entire hectares of land with a deadly carpet, leaving behind only ash and twisted metal. The myth of the invincibility of the German Panzerwaffe burned up in the fire of this hellish rain. 1944. Belarus. Wehrmacht soldier Hans Rott lay in a shallow trench, trying to merge with the earth. He didn't hear gunshots. He didn't see the enemy. He only heard the sound. A sound that began as a low, distant hum, like a swarm of giant wasps. Then it grew, turning into a heavy, oppressive roar. And finally, as the planes emerged from behind the treetops, it became a deafening, soul-shattering howl. A howl that made the blood run cold. A howl that paralyzed the will. "Achtung, Schwarzer Tod!" shouted the Feldwebel, his voice drowned out by the roar. "Attention, the Black Death." This name wasn't born in headquarters or in intelligence reports. It was born here, in the mud and blood of the front lines. It was invented by them, the German infantrymen, for whom an attack by the Ilyushins was not a battle, but an extermination. Hans squeezed his eyes shut and pressed his face into the damp earth. Don't shoot, don't move, just pray. That's all they could do. Firing at these armored monstrosities with a rifle or a machine gun was pointless. The bullets just bounced off them, doing no harm. They were invincible. And then, hell began. The ground around him started to shake, as if it were being ripped apart by a giant saw. It was the attack plane's cannons at work. Shells tore out chunks of turf, blasted breastworks to splinters, and mangled human bodies. Then came a dry, sharp crack. The rockets had been launched. They weren't accurate, but their roar and fiery trails inspired primal terror. Then the bombs fell. Small, anti-personnel bombs that exploded, showering everything in a hailstorm of deadly shrapnel. Hans could feel the earth tremble from the explosions. He could hear the screams of the wounded, which were drowned out by the roar of the engines. It lasted an eternity. A few minutes that stretched into an endless nightmare. They didn't just attack. They pounded their positions. Run after run. Again and again. Until the trenches turned into a mass grave. And on the other side of the field, in the Soviet trenches, infantrymen, hearing the familiar hum, raised their heads. "Our hunchbacks are here," they shouted to each other. For them, this sound was music. It meant salvation. It heralded victory. They saw the German infantry literally press themselves into the ground, stop firing. They waved their caps and shouted, "Go, Ilyusha, go, give 'em hell!" To the Soviet soldier, the Il-2 was Ilyusha, the hunchback, the flying tank. It was one of their own, a symbol of the Red Army's might. When the attack planes left, leaving behind smoke and silence, Hans Rott dared to raise his head. The dead and wounded lay all around. The trench was plowed over. All that was left of the machine gun nest was a pile of earth and twisted metal. And he understood. This isn't an airplane. It's a weapon of psychological warfare. The Black Death didn't just come to kill. It came to destroy hope, to break the spirit, to turn soldiers into animals trembling with terror. And at that task, it was perfect. Senior Lieutenant Sokolov was landing his Il-2 at the airfield. The plane was handling poorly. There was a gaping hole in the wing. The controls were damaged. But he had made it back again, survived again. He taxied to his parking spot, cut the engine, and sat for several minutes in silence, catching his breath. He was used to it. Used to the adrenaline of combat, the smell of gunpowder, the whistle of shrapnel. He was used to surviving, but he could never get used to the silence behind him. He slowly turned his head. The gunner's cockpit was empty. Or rather, it contained what was left of Sergeant Belkin, an 18-year-old boy from Vologda, who had arrived at the regiment just a week ago. This was his third combat mission. Sokolov unbuckled his harness. He climbed out of the cockpit. He didn't look back. The mechanics approached. He silently nodded toward the rear cockpit and walked toward the dugout. "Get him out," he threw over his shoulder. He didn't want to see it. Not again. Belkin was his ninth gunner in less than a year. Sokolov had already stopped memorizing their last names. He tried not to look them in the eyes before a flight, not to talk about home. It was easier to just think of them as gunners. Number 7. Number 8. Number 9. It hurt less that way. The pilot's cockpit was a fortress. The armored tub designed by Ilyushin had saved his life dozens of times. But the gunner sat in hell. He was protected only by a thin 6mm armor plate from behind. From the sides and above, nothing protected him. He was open to all winds and all shrapnel. Any Messerschmitt attacking from above turned his cockpit into a meat grinder. The loss statistics were monstrous. For every one pilot killed in an Il-2, there were 5, sometimes 7, gunners killed. They were expendable. A shield that covered the pilot's back. The price of his survival. That evening, the squadron commander looked into Sokolov's dugout. "Here," he said. "He's flying with you tomorrow. A new one." A skinny, very young lad in a new, still stiff uniform stood in the doorway. He looked at Sokolov with hope and fear. At his new pilot. Sokolov didn't raise his eyes to him. He didn't want to know his name. He didn't want to see that hope in his eyes. "Be ready at 600 hours," he said hollowly, and turned away. The new gunner understood everything without words. To this tired, scorched pilot, he was just another temporary part, an expendable. His task was simple and terrifying: to survive at least one mission, to fend off the Messerschmitts, and if he was lucky, to come back alive. And if not, well, the next one would take his place. Number 10. The Il-2 pilot brought the plane back to the airfield, armored, resilient, capable of withstanding hundreds of hits. But he paid a terrible price for this survivability. He brought home silence, and every time he climbed out of his armored fortress, he left behind another young life, sacrificed for his own. Thus, the story of one aircraft becomes the story of an entire nation. Created with a fatal flaw, washed in the blood of pilots and the sweat of workers, this crude mechanism of metal and wood absorbed a superhuman will to win. It ceased to be just a weapon, becoming a symbol, indestructible, stubborn, and merciless. Where is the line where cold metal gains a soul? And what truly wins a war? The perfection of technology, or the indestructibility of the human spirit, capable of turning even a coffin into an instrument of vengeance? Share your thoughts in the comments. It's important for us to know what this story has awakened in you. If you found this story important, support us with your rating, and subscribe to continue this dialogue about the great and the tragic together.